Okay, we'll start now. For people who are fairly new, I'll introduce myself. I'm Jerry Garfinkel. I'm the treasurer of the Jewish Studies Center. And as such, I always start by telling people that our classes are free. Our instructors are very interesting, but our expenses are there also. So we do need donations. So we encourage people to donate. You can go to our website, www.jewishstudiescenter.org, and you click on donate, and then you can donate either by credit card or by PayPal or by check. If you indicate you want to send a check, it'll give you the address of where to send it. This presentation is being recorded. After the class is over, I'll edit out the part of the recording that's began before the class began, and I'll post it on YouTube, and then I'll send an email to everyone on where to find the recording. The closed captioning is turned on, so if you have hard of hearing, you can't understand either my accent or Joe's accent, you can look at the transcript. Everybody is muted, but we do want your questions and or your comments. So please type your comments or questions in the chat box and address it to everyone, either in the middle or maybe at the end of the presentation. We'll address various questions that have been brought up. I think that's about it for technical stuff. I'll say this is another session 2 of reward and punishment issues in Pirkei Avot. The presenter is Joe Rosenstein, who is an emeritus professor of mathematics at Rutgers University, besides a lot of mathematics articles and books that he's written. He has written a number of Jewish books. He has a siddur, he has a machzor, and he has something else also. And then he also recently wrote a book about his reflections about Pirkei Avot. And I'm not really familiar with the machzor, but he has a great siddur, and the book about Pirkei Avot, I think, is wonderful. So anyway, I'll turn it over to Joe and let him start his presentation. You're muted, Joe. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes. There are people in the waiting room.
They've now been admitted. Thank you.
Very good. Okay. Good evening. Thank you, Jerry. This morning I attended virtually the funeral of my mechutin, my son-in-law's father, Beryl Septimus. Alav Shalom, may he rest in peace. And I would like to dedicate this presentation in his honor and to his memory, even though he would undoubtedly disagree with much of what I will say. So thank you all for coming to this second session of rewards and punishments in Pirkei Avot. Many of you were likely here for the first session, but there are also some people here who were unable to attend the first session and may be unable to listen to the recording of it that Jerry posted. So I will start with a summary. Despite the cautionary statement of Antigonos at the beginning of Pirkei Avot, that we should not serve God in order to receive a reward, a substantial percentage of the Mishnayot in Avot, perhaps 20%, deal with rewards either explicitly or are somehow related to the topic of rewards. People in the first 200 years of the Common Era were concerned about the suffering of the righteous, what we refer to as the theodicy problem. And were also concerned more concretely with the suffering that they had experienced at the hands of the Romans. The Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, had been destroyed together with the glorious city of Jerusalem in the year 70 of the Common Era. And during the rebellion of Bar Kokhba 60 years later, millions of Jews had been kidnapped, tortured, raped, killed, died of starvation and disease, and enslaved by the Romans. Was there no recompense for the suffering of the righteous? Given this context, it is not surprising that the notion of Olam Haba, the world to come, took root in Judaism. Before all of the destruction, Hillel spoke of Olam Haba as a reward for Torah scholars. But after the destruction, it became a solution to the theodicy problem. All the righteous who suffered would have a place in Olam Haba, the world to come. This was enshrined in a Mishnah in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, which stated simply, Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek be'olam haba. Every Jew has a portion in the world to come. 200 years after Hillel, Olam Haba had been transformed from a reward for scholars to a normative expectation for every Jew. When the notion of Olam Haba was first introduced, centuries before the destruction of the temple, it was met with resistance. While the Pharisees, including Hillel, believed in Olam Haba, the Sadducees, drawn mainly from the upper classes of society and the priestly class, opposed the idea. Antigonos, who said that we should serve God without the expectation of receiving a reward in the 3rd century before the Common Era, was perhaps issuing a warning that this nascent perspective would deflect people from serving God selflessly to serving God selfishly, that is, in order to receive some sort of reward. Perhaps Nitai of Arbela, a leader of the Sanhedrin 100 years before Hillel, was insisting that evil will be punished in this world when he said, Al tityaesh min haparanut, don't give up on punishment, in Mishnah 1:7. We will come back to Nitai when we talk about punishments. Even after the temple was destroyed and the Sadducees disappeared, there may have been some doubters. Perhaps Rabbi Yonatan in Mishnah 4:11 still believed in the biblical model because he insisted that those who fulfilled the Torah would be rewarded with wealth, with no mention of Olam Haba. Perhaps Rabbi Levitas in Mishnah 4:4 was insisting that humility was essential because we all become food for worms, apparently denying any future resurrection. Perhaps Rabbi Yanai, who we mentioned last week, said in Mishnah 14 that we cannot explain why the righteous suffer and the evildoers thrive because he could no longer accept the biblical explanation that all will be set right in this world, and was also not fully prepared to accept the new paradigm of Olam Haba, that all will be set right in the next world. But once the statement that all Jews have a portion in Olam Haba was enshrined in the Mishnah, the notion of Olam Haba became fundamental to Judaism. In the previous session, I also talked about 3 strands of rewards that appear in Pirkei Avot. In addition to the Olam Haba strand, there was the Torah strand, that is to say, rewards for those who study Torah, independently of Olam Haba, and another strand, which I refer to as Din v'Cheshbon, rewards for those who were vindicated as a result of the trial and accounting by which their lives were examined. At this point, I will ask if there's any comments or questions. I didn't do that last time and spoke for 40 minutes or so, and I think I tired people out so they didn't have questions at the end. But now today I'm going to stop several times and give you an opportunity to ask questions. Now, I can't see if you raise your hand, but if you do have a question, raise one of these mechanical hands.
Yeah, on the bottom of your screen, you should have something called reactions, which includes raise hand.
Yes. Okay, so Deborah Greitzer has her hand up. Yes, for that, Deborah. welcome to today's session. And yes, and last week's. Go ahead. You're muted.
Where's Debbie?
She said that. Oh, you don't have a question. You're still muted.
Just a minute. I'll unmute her.
I see. Okay, you have to unmute her. Okay.
You can unmute yourself now.
Okay, thank you. I asked you this question this summer. You seem to be limiting your definition of olam haba to a kind of a heaven type thing, a life after death. What about olam haba as an aspiration for doing mitzvot and Torah study and all those things in this life? I mean, I know you've studied Alei Shor a lot, and it certainly seems that Rav Volbe, and I'm sure many of his predecessors, had this idea of, through Hitlamdut and Dot and all those things, merging the physical and the spiritual in this life. And that seems to be a very real aspiration, which doesn't require that kind of Christian thing.
Yeah, so the idea that one can improve one's spiritual life and live a life which is, ideal is there, but it's not really represented in Pirkei Avot very much. We don't.
How do we know that? I mean, because it seems like because they're very short things. They're not developed in the way that
Right.
Alei Shor is developed.
Yes. So I suppose it's possible to interpret everything here as being something that's achievable in this life, but there's nothing there which substantiates that. I mean, it seems very clear. I mean, so for example, one of the quotes that I'll show shortly is makes a very clear distinction between Olam Hazeh, this world, and Olam Haba, the world to come. And from that, we see it's very clear that from that person's perspective, and that was one of the conclusions of Avot, that there's a difference between them.
Well, there's surely it's a difference, but for instance, I don't remember the exact words, but the Mishnah that has about Torah study,
Yes.
that Torah study would lead you to Olam Haba. I'm thinking of Rav Volbe's discussion first of Gan Eden, and how at one point Chava and Adam could see everything together, and that somehow through Torah study, it seems that you could see this world in which the spiritual and the physical are one. And
so that's a perspective, but as I say, I don't hear it in Pirkei Avot. So okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, any other questions at this point? Okay, so I also raised a few questions last time that I said I would respond to in today's session, one of which will address the question that Deborah had. Question one, what is Olam Haba like, according to Hillel and according to later sages? One model that's mentioned in Pirkei Avot is that of a grand banquet hall, perhaps. At the end of Mishnah 320, Rabbi Akiva notes that the judgment is a righteous judgment. He's talking about every person being judged, and everything is in preparation for the Seudah, the banquet. The menu for this banquet includes a huge ox, something called a shor habor, and the Leviathan, which is a huge fish, prepared by God at the beginning of time, which will accommodate all the righteous. Nothing special for vegetarians here. Second question, Do some people have more of a chelik, more of a portion in Olam Haba than other people? So another model of Olam Haba is that of a huge concert hall. It's not described that way, but that's the way I extract from it, where the seats that you get apparently depend on the results of your trial and accounting. The higher your rating, the closer you are to God. This doesn't appear in Pirkei Avot, but it appears near the end of the special piyut, the special prayer called Akdamut, that is recited on the first day of Shavuot before the Torah reading. There are many other conceptions of Olam Haba, but they don't appear in Pirkei Avot. One is modeled on the court of ancient kings, like that of Achashverosh in the book of Esther. Those who are worthy are welcomed into God's court and become divine courtiers. Another is that the world in Olam Haba is turned upside down, the poor becoming healthy and wealthy, and the rich becoming poor and afflicted. In a more spiritual model, disembodied souls are reunited with their source. That's how Maimonides understood Olam Haba. Some people imagine that they are reunited with their departed relatives. This is actually a relatively recent conception, one that is not known in traditional Judaism or even Judaism today. The relative importance of Olam Haba compared to this world, Olam Hazeh, is pointed out by Rabbi Yaakov Korshai in Mishnah 4:21. So, Jerry, please share the first page of my handouts there. So this Rabbi Yaakov was a teacher of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So he was at the end of the 2nd century of the Common Era, and his influence on Rabbi Yehuda may have been responsible for enshrining Olam Haba in Judaism. He said, the world is like a waiting room. This world, Olam Hazeh, is like a waiting room before Olam Haba, the world to come. Prepare yourself in the waiting room so that you may enter the grand ballroom. Okay? Olam Haba is the real deal, or Olam Emet, the true world, as I heard at this morning's funeral. This world, as the Buddhists might say, is but an illusion. You can turn off the sharing for now. By the way, in the last session, I mentioned that although the Mishnah says that everyone has a portion in Olam Haba, some people can lose their portion. In the early years of the modern state of Israel, there was a newspaper called Olam Hazeh, which is the same phrase used in this Mishnah to mean this world, although the name of the newspaper was understood to mean the world today, or today's news of the world. Perhaps its name was intentionally chosen to mock the idea or value of Olam Haba, but following Rabbi Akiva's perspective, it led to the phrase, Mi shekorei olam hazeh, ein lo chelak be'olam haba. Whoever reads Olam Hazeh has no portion in the world to come. Question 3. Does Olam Haba happen immediately after we die, or do we have to wait until everyone dies? There are different views about this, none of which appear in Pirkei Avot. According to some views, we ascend to God's court immediately after we die. According to other views, there's a delay, perhaps a year while Kaddish is said. And according to other views, there may be a long wait, perhaps even until the Jewish year 6000, which some predict will be the date when civilization ends. If everyone goes to Olam Haba directly after they die, then by the time that we get there, Rabbi Akiva, with a 2,000-year head start, will have finished eating the whole Leviathan. I hope you're laughing, but I can't hear you. Question 4, how can a trial take place if we're dead and cannot testify in our defense? So now let's look at slide 2. Rabbi that's one. Next slide. Rabbi Elazar Kapar said, those who were born will die, and those who die will live again. And once alive, will be judged. So that's very interesting. This is an interesting solution. In Rabbi Elazar's view, the purpose of the resurrection of the dead is so that they can be judged, and if needed, put up their own defense. Then what? Well, Rabbi Elazar doesn't say, but presumably, if you qualify for Olam Haba, you go there to everlasting life. And if not, you go back down to Sheol, to everlasting death. But that can't be correct because all Jews have a share in the world to come. So the different observations about life after death are often inconsistent. Maybe you can stop sharing now. I should mention that the resurrection of the dead, which plays a prominent role in the beginning of the Amidah, is not mentioned in Pirkei Avot, except in this Mishnah. Okay, so Mechayei HaMeitim doesn't play a role in Avot at all, except here. And similarly, the Goel, the Redeemer, or Geula, redemption, that is also mentioned at the beginning of the Amidah, is also not mentioned in Pirkei Avot. The Redeemer in the Amidah is the Messiah, the Mashiach. And Rabbi Akiva thought that Bar Kokhba was the Mashiach, who would become king of the Jews and would save the Jews from Rome. Once that revolt failed and the destruction that resulted from it was considered, the idea of another Redeemer was put on the back burner. Another term that is mentioned in Pirkei Avot only once and only incidentally is Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. Okay, so Mindy has a question.
Let me unmute myself. Okay, maybe this is self-evident, but let me ask it anyway. Maybe it's not even in Pirkei Avot. There are certainly righteous people among the nations. What, if anything, do the sages in Pirkei Avot have to say about the rewards for the Hamish, the Menschlichkeit, the courageous of the non-Jews? I guess they don't get to Olam Haba, but what do they get?
No, they do get to Olam Haba. So that's very interesting. I talked about this last time. It's mentioned in Pirkei Avot that Bilam, who was the false prophet who Balak hired to curse the Jews, but he was unable to, it was mentioned that he can't go to Olam Haba. So the question is, why should it specify that Bilam can't go to Olam Haba? What about the rest of the non-Jews? And the answer is that righteous non-Jews do have a place in Olam Haba. Very clear. Not in Pirkei Avot, but elsewhere in the Talmud. Righteous Jews do have a place in Olam Haba. And I mentioned last time that we treat non-Jews in this regard better than most Christians treat Jews, because for most Christians, Jews automatically go to hell. So that's not the case in Judaism.
What are the sources?
I can't tell you off the top of my head, but I can if you email me, I can
Okay.
send you the sources.
All right. Thank you.
My Rebbe taught us that at one point, even though the Romans were, for doing very bad things to the Jews, there were some who were helping the Jews, and that's what got the idea that the righteous people of that sort would also go to Olam Haba.
Right. I mean, so it's no accident that that after the Holocaust, that in Israel was established an idea of the righteous of the nations,
Yeah, right.
and they are respected and honored for their courageousness, even though they didn't think they were doing something courageous. Nevertheless, it was. Vivian has a question.
You can unmute yourself, Vivian.
Yeah, I am. Last time you suggested that Maimonides had been influenced in part by the Islam in which he was situated. Could the life after death in this period be, I mean, what's the interaction between Christianity in Judaism in regard to life after death?
So I don't know the answers to that question. I mean, it's possible that there was some, but remember that for the first 150 or so years, the Common Era, the Christians were a sect within Judaism, and it wasn't until Paul comes along and changes things that they become separate. So I really can't answer your question. I just simply don't know.
Okay.
Whether that's something that was because of them, or whether it was something that was appealed to both groups. So I don't know the Christian Bible well enough to speak to that. Okay,
Thank you.
yeah. Let us now turn to the topic of punishments in Pirkei Avot. So I have to tell you in advance that you should lower your expectations. If you expect to see fire and brimstone emerge from these pages, you will be very disappointed. The sages were not very interested in the punishment of the evildoers. They were much more concerned about the rewards of the righteous. If Dante had looked into Pirkei Avot for ideas that he could borrow for his Inferno, he would also have been very disappointed. As an aside, Dante is mentioned in my book. Here's the story, which I will tell you now because it is connected to Hanukkah, which we will observe in 3 days, 3 nights from now. The hero of Hanukkah, Judah Maccabee, was killed in battle, but his brothers continued the revolt against the local portion of the Greek Empire. After they defeated the Greeks, Judah's brother Shimon became both king and Kohen Gadol, high priest, by acclamation. It was actually a ceremony acclaiming him both of those roles. Unfortunately, Shimon's son-in-law, whose name was Ptolemy, killed Shimon and his 2 sons at a banquet in their honor in the year 135 before the Common Era. Fortunately, Shimon's remaining son, Yochanan, survived and ruled Israel for 30 years. Dante created a separate place in hell for those who were traitors against guests in their home and called it Ptolemea, after this Ptolemy. Okay, let's go to slide. That was a digression. Let's go to slide 3. One type of punishment that is mentioned 3 times in Avot is the word puranut. First introduced by Nitai in Mishnah 1:7. He tells us that we should not give up your conviction that evil behavior will indeed result in retribution. So puranut is translated here as retribution. So in other words, as I mentioned before, this sounds like it agrees with the biblical idea that all will be fixed in this world. The second time the word puranut occurs is in the Mishnah we discussed last time, in which good deeds create defenders and evil deeds create prosecutors. After that, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says that good deeds and tshuva umasim tovim, are a shield against puranut, which here is translated as punishment. Now, is this puranut in this world or in the next world? Well, elsewhere in Pirkei Avot, it says that good deeds and tshuva can only be done in this world, that you can't do tshuva in the next world. If you can think you can wait to do tshuva until you get to the next world, you are in for a surprise. There is no chance to do good deeds or tshuva in Olam Haba. So what Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is saying is that good deeds and tshuva in this world are a shield against puranut in this world. The third time puranut appears is in Mishnah 5:8, which begins, 7 kinds of disasters come to the world for 7 categories of transgression. It then lists the 7 categories and the puranut they bring about. When some people, when some people give tithes and some do not, a famine due to drought comes. When they've all decided not to give tithes, a famine due to upheaval and drought comes, a much more severe famine. when they also decided not to set aside the dough offering, an all-consuming famine comes. So the idea of famine is a very prevalent idea in biblical times and after biblical times. And then there are 4 more clauses which say plague comes to the world, and it gives reasons for plague coming. The sword comes to the world, gives reasons. Wild beasts come to the world. Exile comes to the world. So what you see from this is these are 7 categories of puranut. It is pretty clear that puranut refer to punishments in this world. The descriptions of these 7 categories of sins and their corresponding punishments are so detailed that this Mishnah is the longest Mishnah in Avot and is usually divided into 2. So let me focus for a minute on these 2 Mishnayot, even though I have not provided you detailed texts. It would be easy for us to dismiss these 2 Mishnayot. Now go back to the next slide, and to declare that they are the least relevant and least interesting of all the Mishnayot in Pirkei Avot. They are grounded in an agricultural society that is remote from ours, and they assume that God acts in ways that are foreign to our concept of the divine. But underlying most of these clauses in these 2 Mishnayot are assumptions to which we can and should relate to very positively. The notion that our land and our wealth are not ours but belong to God, that God wants the society to ensure that it provides for everyone's basic needs. I mean, giving tithes is not abstract. This is giving food to people who don't have it. And that there are consequences to our community and our world of our abuse of these principles. We need to be reminded that everything that we have actually belongs to God, however we understand God, or even if we don't use God language. That we are stewards of God's land and its abundance. That God wants us to ensure that social justice prevails throughout our society, and that there are serious consequences when we abuse our earth. The consequences of environmental damage and societal damages are important and very timely lessons, even though they are cloaked in a seemingly irrelevant pair of Mishnayot. Our world is in danger that has come about because of human beings. We need desperately to fix what we have broken. So we need to hear and to heed the warnings expressed in these 2 Mishnayot. Any comments or questions? I can't see anybody, so if you have a comment or question, just make it. It says 2 participants raised hand, but I can't see who they are. So maybe you should turn off the share so we can. Okay. So Jerry, your hand is up, but I assume you did not want to ask a question. But Jerry, I can't read your name.
No, Jerry still wants to
Jerry
ask.
still can. Yes, please ask your question.
We don't hear you, Jerry. You're not muted, but we still don't hear you. I think Jerry's having problems. This has happened before.
Okay.
Oh.
So maybe we should go on. You can.
Well, let's go on, I think.
When you recover your hearing here, you can your sound here will hear you again. Okay. So in addition to the phrase puranut, which occurred 3 times, the phrase gehinom also occurs 3 times. Gehinom is the name of an actual place, a valley outside Jerusalem that is mentioned in the Bible as a site where the Canaanites brought their children as sacrifices to their gods. It is therefore a very undesirable location. Indeed, Jeremiah, the prophet, states that so much innocent blood has been shed there that the place should and one day will be renamed Valley of Murder, Gei HaHariga. And I'm very surprised that it hasn't been changed all these years. Presumably, as the notion of life after death became prominent, one important question was, what happens to the sinners? Shouldn't they be punished? Their punishment was that they were consigned to this place, apparently considered a place of purgatory, although Christians translate it as hell. However, the tradition always understood this as a temporary assignment. So let us ask this question: for what grievous sins does Pirkei Avot consign one to Gehinnom? So now we'll take a look at slide number 5, which has on it the 3 times that Gehinnom is mentioned in Avot. So the first says that too much conversation with women can lead to Gehinnom. I said at the beginning of the last session, that these guys were very wise. I modified that by saying most of the time. So don't object too strongly to what I say here, to what they say here. The first slide says that too much conversation with women could lead one to Gehinnom. Remember that in those days, women typically were not taught Torah, so there was not very much for men to talk about with women, other than their wives, with whom they needed to discuss both domestic issues and intimate relations. Maimonides apparently has a rather low opinion of men. He explains that brings evil on himself, which is in the 3rd line here in this Mishnah, means that he habituates himself to the undesirable character trait of desire, assuming that any contact with women will arouse men sexually and divert them from thoughts of Torah. The second Mishnah where Gehinnom is mentioned is part of a comparison of Abraham and Bilam, who we mentioned before. So Bilam was a prophet who Balak, the king of Moab, employed to curse the Israelites after the exodus from Egypt, so that they would not conquer his kingdom. So Mishnah 5:19 notes that whereas Abraham has a positive outlook, a humble spirit, and a moderate appetite, Bilam has a negative outlook, an arrogant spirit, and an excessive appetite. That's what gets him deposited in Gehinnom. The third Mishnah, at the bottom of the page, suggests that anyone with no shame, who does not get embarrassed by any of his misdeeds, what we might call a person with sociopathic tendencies, also gets the Gehinnom. And there, whereas those who are capable of shame get to the Garden of Eden. That's where they mention the Garden of Eden in Pirkei Avot. So we don't get a sense from these 3 Mishnayot what Gehinnom really represents. It sounds more like a literary device. You will inherit Gehinnom. Sounds like you are damned. So it sounds more like a literary device than the description of an actual location, nor do we know who deserves to go there or what happens there. So that's that for that one. Another phrase that occurs 3 times in Pirkei Avot, and we can go to the next slide, and that seems to be a punishment, is Motzi'in et ha'adam min ha'olam. Remove a person from the world. We may assume, I think, that this was a technical term that was used in common parlance by the sages, but what did they mean by it, and how should we understand it? So let's read through these 3 together. Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananiah said, a negative outlook, the evil inclination, and hatred for humankind remove a person from the world. So these all have remove a person from the world. Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas says, morning sleep, midday wine, conversations with children, and sitting in the assemblies of the ignorant remove a person from the world. Rabbi Elazar HaKapar said, envy, lust, and the desire for honor remove a person from the world. What all 3 Mishnayot describe are people whose behavior does not conform to social norms in different ways. In a sense, they have chosen to live apart from their communities. Thus, the closing phrase, remove a person from the world, does not seem to refer to a punishment, but rather seems to be a statement of fact, that because of their antisocial behavior, these people have removed themselves from the community, have self-marginalized, have made themselves marginal with respect to the community. So let's look more closely at the Rabbi Yeshua's examples at the top. The person with ayin ra sees everything negatively and speaks negatively about everything. Nothing is good enough. No one meets his standards. The world is a terrible place, and he really doesn't want to be there. So in effect, he removes himself from the world. We all have a yetzer hara, evil inclination, but the sages recognized that we could use our yetzer hara in productive ways. Thus, they said if it weren't for one's yetzer hara, nobody would get married or farm one's field or have children. That is, one's yetzer hara motivates us to take actions we might otherwise forego. A goal that each person should have is to use that motivation for positive ends, channeling one's desire for gratification and success productively. So Rabbi Yeshua is not against having and using one's yetzer hara, but against using it in unproductive ways. For example, taking whatever one wants, insisting on instant gratification, violating the rules of society for one's own benefits. The third way Rabbi Yeshua suggests that a person removes himself from the world is simply hating other people. Misanthropes, sadly, remove themselves from the world. Rabbi Dosa gives 4 separate ways in which a person can opt out of normal life. If he sleeps late, then he neglects both daily prayers and a normal work routine. Similarly, getting drunk in the middle of the day will make it impossible for him to support himself and a family, or make it impossible for him to have a family. Spending time with children is wasting time. In those days, taking care of children was inappropriate behavior for a man, and not a way to earn a living. Similarly, spending time engaged in pointless discussions with others also deprive him of the possibility of having a normal life. All these behaviors, again, quote, remove a person from living in the real world. And turning now to Rabbi Elazar at the bottom of the screen, a person who is full of envy, who wants what other people have, who is indignant that other people have what he doesn't, cannot live in the world because the world does not provide him what he wants, what he thinks, what he deserves. As Ben Zoma points out in Mishnah 4:1, such a person can never be wealthy, can never be satisfied, can never be grateful. Such a person has removed himself from the world. He is not comfortable in the world and wants to be in a world where he has everything he wants. A person who is full of lust, like every other addict, is constantly looking for his next fix, for the satisfaction that it will give him, however momentary. He appears to be in this world, but is actually only lurking here. His focus is on finding someone or something to help him fulfill his desires. He does not live in the same world that most of us inhabit. And finally, a person who constantly needs the praise of others, who is constantly looking for approval, all of whose speech and actions are designed to show that he is right, we don't need to dig very deep to find an example of such a person and of the evil consequences of his behavior. We look at such a person and ask, what world does he live in? He does not live in the same world that most of us inhabit. Thus, as I noted at the outset, the closing phrase, Motzin et Adam min olam, remove a person from the world, does not seem to refer to some kind of punishment, but seems rather to be a statement of fact, that because of their antisocial behavior, these people have removed themselves from the community, have self-marginalized. Let me give you another opportunity to ask any questions before I go on to additional phrases which occur in Avot that can be thought of as punishments. Anyone have any questions? Again, I can't see. Jerry, can you, should we turn off? If someone has a question, just go ahead and ask it then.
You have a question, you can
Okay,
unmute yourself and ask it, but I don't see anyone.
you don't see any hands.
indicating
Okay,
a question.
all right. So I'll go ahead and we'll go ahead to the next screen. A fourth phrase that occurs 3 times in Pirkei Avot, and one that seems to be a punishment, is mitchayev b'nafsho. You can turn to the next slide. Mitchayev b'nafsho, which could mean puts his life at risk, or it could mean puts his soul at risk, because nefesh is used in both ways. In Mishnah 3:5, a person who can't fall asleep goes out for a walk and turns his thoughts to idle matters, puts his life at risk. Now that doesn't make sense. Anyone who went out at night in ancient times was at risk. What does turning one's thought to idle matters have to do with it? So we revise our understanding of the scenario and say that this is a budding Torah scholar who goes out at night, and he encounters risks that would lead him off his intended path. Perhaps he will encounter someone who would lead him astray. Better he should not go for a walk, stay home and focus on his studies. So mitchayev b'nafsho is better translated as puts his soul at risk. Let's see if that's true of the other 2 Mishnayot. Mishnah 3.9, which occurs next, is puzzling. It says if one is memorizing his lessons while walking on the road, and it interrupts his study and says, "How beautiful is this tree," or "How beautiful is the smell of this newly plowed field," the Bible regards it as if he has put his life in danger. So that's puzzling. Why would doing so put his life or even his soul at risk? Now, most translations, instead of saying if one is memorizing his lessons, say if one is studying his lessons, but I made the translation, you are memorizing your lessons. So the scenario is that the budding Torah scholar has just attended a shiur, a lecture, and has to memorize what was said. Remember that writing implements and writing materials were scarce in those days. So if he is distracted and remembers something incorrectly, he may in the future give incorrect advice or make incorrect decisions and be responsible for the results. As Rabbi Yehuda Bar Elai says in Mishnah 4:16, which you don't have here, be careful in your learning of Torah, for your subsequent teachings or rulings that is based on an error in your learning counts as a deliberate sin. So it is dangerous to interrupt your memorization. And if you do, your soul will be at risk. So this Mishnah doesn't say, if he's walking along and he sees a beautiful tree, he shouldn't admire the tree and even make a bracha over this amazing creation that God has made. It says that if he's memorizing his lessons, he better make sure that he does it correctly. Mishnah 3:10 at the bottom of this page makes essentially the same point, but in a more general context. If you forget anything that you have learned, you put your soul at risk. You can't rely on a set of books. You don't have any. You can't look things up on the internet. You have to rely on your memory. And if that is faulty, you will make serious mistakes and bear responsibility for them. Again, it will be your soul that is at risk. It is clear, therefore, that these 3 Mishnayot understand mitchayev b'nafsho as you will put your soul at risk, rather than you will put your life at risk, and therefore it cannot be considered as a punishment, just simply a fact of life, that if you get things wrong, then you're going to be responsible for the consequences of your mistaken understanding of Torah. A 5th pair of Mishnayot, so we can go to the next slide, talk about the consequences of benefiting inappropriately from the Torah. Maybe before I do this, anyone have any question? You have one, go ahead. No, okay. So these talk about benefiting inappropriately from the Torah. Mishnah 113 is in Aramaic, which is the language that was used in Babylonia, where Hillel came from. And apparently the Aramaic that they spoke was much more terse, and fewer words were necessary. So Hillel often speaks in Aramaic. So it says, a person who makes use of the crown of the Torah for his own purposes shall perish. The following Mishnah by Rabbi Tzadok is an extension of Mishnah 113. It repeats and expands on what Hillel had said 2 generations earlier. So he says, do not make the words of Torah a crown for self-promotion, nor a shovel with which to dig. It's not clear what that metaphor means. So too Hillel said, and then he quotes Hillel, he that puts the crown to his own use shall perish. Thus, you have learned, anyone who derives worldly benefit from the words of the Torah, his life is removed from the world. Notel chayav min halam. That sounds like a very severe punishment. And it's a punishment for only one thing, for misusing the words of the Torah. Now, here's an interesting historical issue. In his commentary on Avot, so let's go on to slide 9, the next slide. I don't know if you can read this, it's a little bit small, well, I'll read it. Okay, in his commentary on Avot, Maimonides argues vehemently that Hillel is saying that one should not receive monetary payments or any payments from teaching Torah. He restates the message of this Mishnah. This means, quote, this means that one should not consider the Torah as a means to earn one's livelihood. And he continues, the Mishnah says that anyone who derives benefit from the honor of the Torah in this world will have his soul cut off from Olam Haba. People ignore this clear and obvious message. You're a little ahead of me here. People ignore this clear and obvious message and refuse to pay attention to it. Not only does he restate the teaching more explicitly, he increases the punishment for its violation. Those who earn a living from Torah will lose their place in Olam Haba. That's a real penalty. Moreover, he attacks those who do this most vigorously. He says, quote, they deceived people with a blatant misconception, saying that it is an obligation and a necessity to help the scholars, their students, and those people who are involved in the Torah, and for whom the Torah is their occupation. He says, our sages did not tax the people or gather alms to support yeshivot, nor for the judges, nor for those who spread knowledge. He continues, Hillel was a wood chopper. No thinking person would doubt that if he had allowed people to assist him, they would not have let him continue chopping wood. And he continues, the sages considered that asking for assistance would be desecrating the name of God in the eyes of the public, where they would think that the Torah is a profession like other professions from which people derive their livelihood. This would cause them to lose respect for the Torah. Thus, rabbis and teachers should not be paid for teaching Torah. They should have an occupation that sustains them, as Hillel did himself. All of these are stated even more strongly in Maimonides' major code, the Mishnah Torah, where he says that a person who uses the Torah as a means to earn one's livelihood commits chilul Hashem, desecration of the name of God, shows contempt for the Torah, extinguishes the light of religion, brings evil upon himself, and removes his life from Olam Haba. All of these things happen to him. Now, although Maimonides insisted that one should not be paid for teaching Torah, that it would be a desecration of God's name, and that the teacher would lose his place in Olam Haba, his view was rejected by almost every prominent rabbi of the last 1,000 years. They argued that if Torah scholars were not supported by their community, then their scholarship would be diminished. And if students were not supported by their community, then the next generation of scholars would be diminished as well. So Maimonides' perspective, though stated and defended vigorously, was not adopted by the Jewish community. Theoretically, it may be justified, but in practice, it could not work. So if that's not what Hillel and Rabbi Tzadok meant, what could they have meant? Hillel's three-word statement is perhaps cryptic, but Rabbi Tzadok is quite clear. Although it seems to be agreed that one can be paid for learning or teaching Torah, contrary to the strongly held views of Maimonides, the teachings of these two Mishnayot stand. One may not use one's knowledge of Torah for self-promotion or as a means to become wealthy. And the punishment for doing so is severe. His life is removed from the world. Perhaps more severe than the other categories that we looked at. Any comments or questions about that? Anything in the chat that I should be aware of? Okay, so I'll go ahead. Not far from the end, there's a sixth punishment, which is mentioned only once in Mishnah 5:18. I don't have that on the screen, but if a person causes others to sin, he is denied the possibility of tshuva, of repentance, since he is responsible for the sins that the others committed, and he can't do tshuva for someone else's sins. If the number of people involved is small, he can perhaps get them each to do tshuva and then do tshuva himself. But if he caused many people to sin, getting them all to repent would be impossible. The example given in Mishnah 5:18 is Jeroboam, who caused all of the people in the kingdom of Israel to sin. So recall that the kingdom of Israel was formed when the 10 tribes seceded from the kingdom of Judah after the death of Solomon. Jeroboam realized that it was problematic for those in the kingdom of Israel to travel to Jerusalem to the temple to worship God, so he built 2 temples in which God was represented by a golden calf, and thereby he caused many people to sin. Now, that's pretty much all that Pirkei Avot has to say about punishments. If you were expecting hell, fire, and brimstone, you were probably disappointed, but I warned you in advance. So now let's look at slide 10 for a summary of the punishments. We discussed 6 sets of phrases. In Pirkei Avot. Okay, and this is pretty much the only things that reference anything remotely resembling punishment. There were 3 phrases. There were 3 Mishnayot which talked about puranut, which are disasters in this world as a consequence of communal misbehavior. There were 3 verses, 3 Mishnayot, which involved Gehinnom, but that provided little information on who goes there and what tortures, if any, they will suffer. There were 3 Mishnayot involving people who, because of their habits or perspectives, essentially remove themselves from the community. There were 3 Mishnayot involving the consequences of not properly remembering the Torah. The consequence is of not remembering the Torah is endangering one's soul. There were 2 Mishnayot which involved the consequences of using the Torah for one's own personal benefit. Such a person will perish. And the final is that there is 1 Mishnah which involves a person who causes others to sin, and such a person is denied the possibility for tshuva. I'm just going to be done in one moment, and then you can ask questions. So you can remove the screen sharing now, Jerry. Okay. So here is a brief summary of both presentations. Although Pirkei Avot does not provide many details, it is clearly committed to the existence of a place and time, namely Olam Haba, where the righteous are rewarded, but it seems to be little concerned with how the evildoers will get their just deserts. So that's the end of my presentation. I thank you for attending, and I encourage you to visit my website, which is simply joerosenstein.com. And I encourage you to purchase a copy of this book, which Jerry showed last time, and I'm showing this time. It's currently available at a 20% discount for the rest of December. And I'm teaching a course based on the book starting at the end of January, which you can find out about at my website, again, joerosenstein.com. And so now we will have time for additional comments and questions. And I see that Mindy has her hand up. Yes.
Yeah, I'm back again. It's clear that most of the discussion focuses on men and maybe boys who are students. The last stipulation of someone who incites others to sin is going to be in trouble, and that could apply to a woman. Do you have any comments about the applicability of rewards and punishments toward girls and women? And did the sages have anything to say?
So they don't have anything to say about it. I assume that, you know, if righteous people have a share in Olam Haba, then women do too. I mean, it says Kol Yisrael.
Yes.
All people, all Jews have a share in Olam Haba. So there's no reason to think that women should be excluded from that. I mean, if they do righteous deeds, and if they don't violate the commandments, then yes, there should be no reason why they should not have a share in Olam Haba. Whatever that means, there's no reason for them to not gain access to it.
But certainly for those who are studying Torah, women are not in that universe.
They were not in in that universe then,
Yes.
and they were not in that universe 30 or 40 years ago.
Right.
Much has changed in the last
Yes.
generation.
Yes.
So now that it's quite different. I mean, although there's a very prominent woman in the Talmud, Bruria, who is the wife of Rabbi Meir, whose father was Rabbi Hanania, who we mentioned earlier, and she was learned because her father taught her.
Yes, that's right.
There were probably some others who are less prominent, and there may be many more who did know about the Torah, but did not get they're not mentioned in the discussions. Perhaps they knew about the Torah, but never participated in the discussions with the other rabbis. You know, It may have been at certain times they were allowed to, and other times they weren't. It may be that even Bruria, I don't know what her whether she had access to the academy or whether her husband, Rabbi Meir, would quote her in discussions.
Maimonides didn't have much to say about women. I know you haven't read everything he's ever written.
I'm sorry, say that again.
I would imagine Maimonides didn't have much to say regarding women in any of his voluminous commentaries.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I certainly have not read sufficiently much of Maimonides to know that, but I would suspect that was not his main. The women were not his main concern.
Yeah.
I really can't answer that for sure.
A nice subject for further research.
Yes. Vivian, you have a question again?
It's very tempting, at least to me, to use causing others to sin to apply to current political events. Is that kosher?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, that's certainly a possible interpretation. It's estimated that that of the people who died of COVID, a substantial number of them should not have died.
That's right.
That's
Disinformation and
misinformation, so that's and one theme that runs through Pirkei Avot is being very careful with the information you distribute. Now, in those days, information didn't travel fast and didn't travel to everybody, but they knew that somebody who had the wrong information would have negative effects. And we see that now, that misinformation can cause all sorts of problems. So,
and there are people who know better and still put out.
yes, that's
So,
right.
so they're causing, they're causing great harm.
Yes.
And I would like to quote Pirkei Avot to them, but I don't know if it would do any good.
Yeah, you're probably right. So the most telling statement is Chachamim hizaharu b'divrechem. Sages, be very careful about your words, and that certainly applies to non-sages as well. If it applies to sages, then kal v'chomer, even more so, it applies to people who are not sages, who are ignorant and just disruptive. Debbie?
Yeah. So just this conversation that we just had, I'm wondering what you do when the person who is causing the problem or supplying the misinformation is simply not aware, is unable to connect cause and effect. I've been teaching learning disabled kids, and some of those kids do not understand cause and effect. If you tell them to stop doing something and penalize them, they think you're being mean to them. They cannot connect it to their actions.
Yes.
So my question is, for the people who cannot connect their actions to the results, is it still a penalty or a crime, or is there some kind of pass that you give because of lack of cognitive abilities?
It's a good question. I don't know how to answer that.
And I don't think the rabbis discussed it either.
Well, they did discuss different kinds of learners, and they were clearly aware that some people just couldn't. And they may not have had the labels that we have, and they may not have had the terminology that we have, and they didn't necessarily have solutions. In one example, there's one Mishnah where they end up saying, if so-and-so does this, then he's a good person. If so-and-so does that, it's a bad person. But if so-and-so does this, he's in an unfortunate situation. Basically, they say he got dealt a bad deck of cards or bad hand. So in that sense, they understood that it was possible for people to end up, as some of your students are, unable to make connection between the deeds that they do and the consequences of those deeds.
That's why the 4 sons during the Pesach service and Haggadah,
yes,
allude to that in some form.
Yeah. Well, the last one is She'eno Yodei Lishol. He doesn't know to ask. Now, but it doesn't imply that he is. That implies that he's immature, but it doesn't imply that he is, as Debbie's students, some of Debbie's students are. They just can't make the connection. And
Well, I think you could interpret it both ways, though.
Okay, that's possible. That's possible.
Yeah.
Anyone else have a question?
Well, I have a comment on what you were saying before. You were talking at one point about some kind of actions which have been interpreted as punishments, but you said that often it brings a person outside of the usual social world, and perhaps people with cognitive disabilities are by themselves outside of the social world because they can't really relate to
Yes.
the various things.
Yes. So I think that if you remember, one of those people who talked about people who remove themselves from the world is someone who plays with children. And I think what they had in mind was exactly someone like this. It was an adult who was someone who was chronologically an adult, but emotionally, psychologically, intellectually a child. And they must have had people like that. And so they said, that's an unfortunate situation. You should try to, you shouldn't put yourself in that situation, but there are some people in that situation, obviously. Other questions? Now there's two things in the chat here. One, Caleb Kreisberg asks, he mentions that there's a story by I.B. Singer about a Gentile washerwoman who would have a place in the world to come. So that sort of goes along with what I said before. That the person who is not Jewish has the opportunity to earn a place in the world to come. Deborah Greitzer asks, what's the source of this Maimonides quote? I don't remember which quote you were asking about. Are you still here, Deborah?
Yeah, the long section that you read about the not receiving payment for teaching Torah.
That's in the Mishnah Torah. Yeah.
Oh,
I don't know it off the top of my head, but I can provide it for you. If you send me an email reminder, you have my email address. Send me an email reminder, and I'll tell you exactly where it is.
okay. Thank you very much.
I wonder what century it was decided it was okay to take payment for teaching Torah. You know, when did the rules change?
Okay, so before Maimonides. In other words, Maimonides was arguing so vehemently against it because that was the common practice in his time. His time already. So in other words, he was not speaking theoretically. He was actually arguing against it. He, of course, as you know, was a physician, and he actually became the personal physician of the Caliph Saladin, who was the Caliph of all of Egypt and Palestine and all that whole area. And so that's how he earned a living. And he complained very much about not having any time for Torah because he would work all day in the court, and then he would come home and find dozens of people looking for his medical advice, and then people looking for his Torah advice, and only after all of that could he get to what he really wanted to do, was to write important Jewish texts. Yet, nevertheless, he managed to do so. But he does complain about it. So even though he says you have to have your own profession, it's not so clear that if he had to do it all over again, he would have done the same.
I think he also had a very wealthy brother who helped him too and supported him. And
yes,
yeah,
his brother supported him, and the great tragedy of his life was when his brother disappeared. He was on a voyage, and presumably he was on a ship that sank or was captured by pirates or something like that. And he spent several years being depressed as a result. But yes, he was. It may very well have been that his brother supported him, even though, other comments or questions? Okay, so we have. Okay, so we're past 8:15, but if someone wants to ask, jump up and ask. Okay, so if not, then I will thank you all again for coming, And again, remind you, please order a copy of my book, joerosenstein.com.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for all the
Good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
who've been here and had good questions. And I'll remind people also that this coming Wednesday, which would be the fourth candle of Hanukkah, we're going to have a talk by Sarah Birnbach about a daughter's Kaddish. It turns out that night also is the yahrzeit for my father, so I'll be, I'll Kaddish sometime soon also. So anyway, I hope you register and come to next week's talk. And again, thank you, Joe. And when I write the email about where the recording is, there'll be more information about, Joe's website and his book and how to find it and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so I think we'll end this now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
Rav Todot.
Again, Rav Todot.
Bye-bye, everyone.
All right.